Aged care providers claim they can't afford to pay workers significantly more for at least 2 years. That's despite record funding delivered in last week's federal budget. The $18 billion spend is designed to improve the quality of residential and home care. There are also measures to improve training and conditions, including better pay for staff. But the Fair Work Commission is under pressure to reject a significant increase to minimum and award pay when a decision is due in July. 200,000 aged care workers are demanding a 25% pay rise. That's about $5 more an hour. Joining me live is Shadow Aged Care Minister Clare O'Neill. And Clare, can these providers really not afford to pay people more?
Well, Laura, I think the bigger issue here is that there's nothing in the government's package to provide for increased pay for workers in aged care. So before we get into any discussion about who's going to pay for it, we actually need some kind of commitment behind it. And Laura, I think this is a crucially important issue because aged care workers are some of the worst paid people in the Australian economy. They're doing some incredibly complex, difficult work, managing people who have a whole range of different illnesses and issues. It's emotionally very taxing on them, but perhaps even the broader point here, Laura, is that we are going to have to recruit 700,000 additional workers into aged care up until 2050 to cope with our ageing population. There's just no way that we're going to be able to do that when this is a job that's been so badly disrespected and undervalued by the Morrison government. So I think the big issue here is the government has completed an aged care package last week that completely missed the most important issue that faces this sector, and that is the way that the workforce are being treated.
Well, $18 billion is being put into the sector over the next 4 years. It's less than the Royal Commission recommended, but you'd think with that money going in that private providers might be able to then find more money to pay their staff more.
Laura, I understand that for everyday people on the street, $18 billion probably sounds like a hell of a lot of money. But when we put it in the context of the aged care spend and just how diabolical this crisis is at the moment, you'll understand that it's actually not it's actually not going to be enough to get us out of crisis and to fix this sector. Laura, if I can just remind your viewers, they're probably aware of this, the Aged Care Royal Commission told us that 2/3 of residents in aged care today are malnourished or at risk of being malnourished. So what we're saying here is that there are 2/3 of these residents who are in the care of their own government are literally starving on their watch. This is the magnitude and the scale of the horror that is out there in aged care today. And this package that was put forward by the government last week, unfortunately, it won't even fix the fundamental issues that created the crisis to begin with. Just one other example that would be close to the hearts of many of your viewers is the issues facing home care. There are 100,000 Australians today who have been told by the Morrison government that they need extra supports to stay safely in their own home to age in place. And the Morrison government is making them wait for sometimes longer than 2 years. And many of those people on the wait list end up either having to be forced into residential aged care or tragically pass away while they're waiting for those crucial supports. Now, the government's package doesn't even clear that home care wait list. So unfortunately, from my point of view, the malnourishment issue isn't being solved, the home care waitlist isn't being resolved, and the critical issues facing the workforce, which is the centrepiece of this whole reform exercise, were completely left on the table. So it just wasn't good enough.
Let me just stick on wages for a moment, because as you know, a lot of these childcare facilities are privately run for a big profit. So can't they afford to pay their workers more?
Laura, I mean, for better or worse, we have a system here that is almost completely, or it's in very large part, funded by the federal government. So I know people want to point to the providers. We have in aged care a mix of providers, some of whom are doing a remarkable job on very little resourcing, others of whom, frankly, are taking their residents for a ride and using money that should be going into care to buy Maseratis for the CEO. And no one is angrier about that than me. But ultimately, we've got to come back to the source of funding here, and that is the Australian federal government. It is not for aged care providers to make decisions on a case-by-case basis about what the award looks like. We've got an industrial relations system here that has decided that these workers, predominantly female workers, who are doing some of the most important work in the community, are going to be paid abysmally for it. Now, the federal government was told by the Royal Commission to step into that process, to collaborate with workers and with providers to push Fair Work to increase the award. And instead, their response was a slap in the face to every aged care worker and every aged care resident in this country. Basically, they're refusing to do anything about the fact that these people are caring for some of the most vulnerable people in our community. And Laura, you know, we're all going to get old. That's just a fact of life. And for you and me, perhaps people who are our age or around our age, it feels like a remote future. The truth is that for women of our age, we've got a 55% chance throughout our lives of spending time in aged care. The average length of spend time in aged care is more than 2 years. So this is a problem that affects every Australian, and every Australian should be absolutely ropeable and angry at the government for the crisis they've been allowed to develop.
It's interesting, the dust has settled on the budget. It was over a week ago now, but in between now and then, the budget when it comes to aged care has almost been roundly praised by the sector. Am I missing something here?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it's been getting praise from every quarters, and I think there's people who are taking time to reflect on that package and looking, as I have, at the sort of gaping holes in it. But Laura, I think the government's been very tricky and quite nasty about how they've managed this issue. I think a lot of people in Australia right now wouldn't realise that the government has formally responded to the Royal Commission's recommendations, and that's because the government deliberately folded the response into the budget process. So for your many friends in the press gallery who were in the lockup, they'll know that they were given a 25-minute briefing on the Aged Care Royal Commission response. Journalists were not given proper opportunity to interrogate the response. In fact, they weren't even given it until a few journalists complained. And it's quite reminiscent of the fact that when the Royal Commission final response was released, journalists were given an 8-volume document 5 minutes before a press conference with the Prime Minister. And this is the way that the government's tried to handle aged care all the time. They want Australians to listen to their media spin but not have a proper opportunity to interrogate the package. And that's why it's so important, Laura, that we don't let this issue fade away. Older people in this country are being profoundly mistreated.
Our viewers wouldn't let us do that, and we're certainly not going to do that here on AM Agenda. But if I could ask you a final question about an issue that I think sounds really good but perhaps has a few problems going forward, and that is, you know, the government has been called on to have minimum staff to patient ratios. It didn't go that far because there's an obvious skills shortage, so perhaps that's why it didn't do it. But instead, it said that there needed to be a minimum 200 minutes a day. How could that possibly be monitored? So the announcement was made in the budget, but there was no, it seems, requirement to actually be held to that. Is that your read of it?
Yeah. It's a really good question, Laura. So the Royal Commission made a recommendation that we increase the care minutes provided to aged care residents in 2 stages. So we would eventually get up to 220 minutes of care a day. The government just fobbed that recommendation off and said that it was only going to make a moderate increase to care minutes of 20 minutes a day per resident. Now, you make a really good point. One of the things that's been awful about the government's package is the lack of transparency across a range of issues. Just one example is the government has given a $10 increase per bed per day to aged care providers. It's $3.2 billion of that overall package with essentially no strings attached. Now, there's no reason for aged care providers to spend that on care, which is what it should be spent on. And you make the point about care minutes. You know, I've already heard stories of aged care providers saying that they're going to count the time that a cleaner is in a resident's room as care minutes, that they're going to try to count the time that carers are updating medical charts and other things of residents while they're on their computer, when they should be, you know, having the time to spend with patients. So unfortunately, if we take this approach to aged care in Australia, where essentially we're not willing to crack down on dodgy providers, we're never going to see the type of change that we want to see. And that was what the government's proposal put forward, a whole bunch of additional dollars going to providers, essentially with no strings attached. And I just don't think that's the right approach.
Just finally, and it's completely off topic, I want to ask you about this curry announcement today. It's been pushed by some locally, but what do you think about it?
Sorry, Laura, I didn't catch the announcement.
Oh, the $600 million to a gas-fired plant, a power plant in Kurri Kurri. It's in the Upper Hunter region. There's maybe a little by-election, a few marginal seats there going into an election. And it comes just a day after the International Energy Agency has said that the use of fossil fuels needs to wind down dramatically in the next 15 years.
Laura, I haven't seen the announcement, so it's probably not such a great idea for me to wade into commentary on it, but I'm sure Chris Bowen will be out today and making some comments about that.
Indeed. Yep, that was our question without notice. Thanks so much, Claire. We'll speak to you again about aged care. Appreciate it.